It is day 20 of the declaration of national emergency. The President of the United States has told us we're in a national emergency. Do you feel it? Can you feel it? No. But what's a real emergency is the epidemic of domestic violence across America and all its attendant consequences, including death, injury, homelessness. I'd like to spend the next few moments talking about the connection between domestic violence and homelessness. In Los Angeles County and in my district in Los Angeles County, one of the biggest issues I hear about is homelessness. And for several years, the number of people experiencing homelessness has grown, and part of this is connected to domestic violence. In 2018, nearly 53,000 people were experiencing homelessness in LA County, 16,000 of whom were women. And then according to the data looking at the LA County continuum of care area, nearly half of women who experience homelessness reported that they also experienced domestic violence. According to the National Network to End Domestic Violence in 2015, 7,728 adults and children fleeing domestic violence sought refuge in the emergency shelter or transitional housing program, but their needs went unmet. So my question is to Ms. Valenti. In your written testimony, you noted that domestic violence is a leading cause of family homelessness. You also mentioned that VAWA programs that provide housing support for domestic violence survivors exist, but that gaps remain. Could you please elaborate a little bit on what steps you can take to ensure domestic violence survivors do not experience homelessness?
Yes, and I also want to acknowledge at this point that the National Network to End Domestic Violence does have a representative here, and at the end of the hearing, I know that their expertise would be very valuable to you, and I'd be happy to make sure that you speak with them. They have a lot of information on housing.
Thank you.
Housing is one of the #1 concerns. I think Judge Gonzalez made reference to that earlier. Without secure housing, many survivors are going to return. Many survivors go into shelter, which have limits of 30 to 90 days of staying so that others may use it, and many return home to the place where the violence occurred. What we need are more housing vouchers. We need more of an ability for survivors to be able to have financial supports so that one of the biggest problems that people tell us is they can't get the first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposit put together. Funding that allows that, many survivors have jobs. They just have to be able to get into housing. So some of the things that we're talking about are addressing those needs. We also know that there are many survivors who are evicted from housing, public housing and private housing, because of the crimes that the abuser commits. And so they, as victims, must suffer the same punishment, which means that they are thrown out of the housing as well. We need to keep that from happening. And those are the sorts of protections that we're talking about.
Thank you. I want to say that when I was in the California State Legislature, I passed a law that allowed victims of domestic violence to break their leases with their landlords so that they could stay and not have to move out. So they could move out and not have to stay. So my next question is to Judge Gonzalez. In your written testimony, you discussed the impact of evictions on the ability of domestic violence survivors to find housing using vouchers. Are there protections for domestic violence survivors to prevent them from being evicted if their abuser is involved in criminal activities?
No, we don't have any protections for them to not be evicted. It's basically a private contract between the landlord and the tenant. In my example that I used in my written testimony, there's a dual lease, and the victim of domestic violence leaves to go get a protective order, so it goes temporarily into shelter, and while she's gone, there is an eviction because of the criminal behavior in the household, and the abuser goes and says, sure, go ahead, evict me. But by the time we get to that writ of eviction, it is the victim who's being served with that writ of eviction by the sheriff. And at this point, it's very difficult for her to go back and try and get that eviction reversed.
Thank you. And Ms. Valenti, do you have any additional comments on that? Great, thank you. Who am I having next? Okay, so I'm going to yield back.